is Tom Frank, and welcome to episode 49 of But Let's Face It. A lot of backlash has sprung up on the internet about Bill Maher's monologue criticizing fans of Stan Lee. His overall point is that adults should act like adults. While I agree with this concept, to me, acting like an adult simply means being responsible. As long as it's not hurting anyone, what adults do with their free time and disposable income is really their business. But let's face it, Bill Maher is looking at fandom from the outside and completely doesn't understand the work of Stan Lee. He is confusing, conflating, and lumping things together that are not connected in this rambling and ill-conceived argument. Bill Maher has always had horrible middle-brow taste, and the fact that he can't recognize comic books as great art is hardly surprising. Comic books were indeed for kids. Even when comics began introducing stories featuring socially conscious topics like drugs and race relations in the late 1960s, and then again in the 1970s, I'll entertain the argument that adults weren't the target audience. But by the time Will Eisner's graphic novel A Contract with God came out in 1978, that argument ends. At that point, American comic books really became for everyone. Or, as famous French film critic Claude Bailey put it, the ninth art. Comics truly became more sophisticated in the 1980s with things like Watchmen, The Dark Knight Returns, Parable, and of course, Mouse, which won the Pulitzer Prize. But how could one expect Bill Maher to be aware of the 80s revolution in comic books? He was far too busy, what with the extensive pre-production on DC Cab and all. A point that both sides of this argument get wrong is the idea that touching upon important subjects makes a story important, or even good. A well-told adventure story is worthy of the attention of adults. Stan Lee understood this. Bill Maher does not. Didactic, lecturing stories explaining the flaws of the world in a ham-fisted manner are not examples of good art. Garbage movies like Bulworth and Syriana seem wonderful to people like Bill Maher, even though they are incredibly childish and reductive. That a script like Starship Troopers is far more interesting politically than those movies would seem insane to Bill Maher. But Ed Neumeyer is a far more nuanced screenwriter than Warren Beatty or Stephen Gaghan. On Twitter, someone wrote to Bill Maher, "I learned about social justice and racial tolerance by reading comic books," to which Bill told him to read James Baldwin, Toni Morrison, and Michael Eric Dyson. And it's very predictable of Bill Maher to assume that he hadn't already read those authors, that there's no overlap between people reading comic books and reading anything else. Ironically, there's a very good comic book by Jordan Clark called Still Not Equal, based on Michael Eric Dyson's Equal in Paris. Bill Maher says he gets upset when he hears that comic books are profound meditations on the human condition. Well, while that's definitely true in the case of the Silver Surfer, that's not what made Stan Lee great. Stan Lee was very well read, and he understood the classics, in the way that Homer followed up the Iliad with the even more exciting journey of Odysseus' voyage home, and in the way that Sophocles had famous heroes from mythology spill into his Theban trilogy. Stan Lee created an interconnected universe and continually expanded on it. The increased depth he gave his characters was also revolutionary. Spider-Man and Shazam, Captain Marvel, both have alter egos that face the struggles of youth. But that Peter Parker is far more interesting and relatable than Billy Batson means nothing to Bill Maher. At the end of the day, Captain America Civil War and Batman vs. Superman Dawn of Justice are both films dealing with the issues of collateral damage. But one is excellent and the other one is garbage. And to Bill Maher, they're interchangeable. The Stan Lee Foundation wrote to Bill Maher and said, "You have the right to your opinion that comic books are childish and unsophisticated." Many said the same thing about Dickens, Steinbeck, Melville, and even Shakespeare. Bill Maher replied, "No, they didn't. No one ever said that. If you ever read a book without pictures, you would know that." The Stan Lee Foundation is, of course, completely correct. Shakespeare was often attacked for crassly playing to the groundlings. He wasn't considered nearly as elegant as Ben Jonson or Christopher Marlowe. Abraham Wright criticized Hamlet as a mediocre play with bad dialogue. Moby Dick got slammed horribly by British critics when it debuted in the UK. And guess what, Bill? Moby Dick has pictures in it. If you know Bill Maher at all, this stance and monologue should come as no surprise, since he has always been obsessed with the patina of sophistication. Bill Maher is so determined to talk about serious topics so he can be taken seriously. He is like Empress Catherine II, beguiled by the facade of an empty Potemkin village, no matter how many times it appears in front of him. He reeks of more intellectual insecurity than Woody Allen, for Christ's sake. I mean, how many times do we have to hear from Bill Maher that he did his undergrad at Cornell? And all of this has blinded him to the greatness of Stan Lee. Right now, this very second, there's an exhibit of comic book art on display at the Louvre, and I'm sure Bill Maher is ignorant of this fact, and it would upset him to learn about it. That The Dark Knight Returns is a more powerful Götterdämmerung than the opera of the same name is inconceivable to Bill Maher. To him, comics like Saga and Cyberfrog are one and the same, and that makes him not worth listening to. One thing that Stan Lee and Bill Maher have in common is that their works are a collaborative effort. For the real-time show, Bill Maher has a writing staff which has to crank out a lot of material. On a much bigger scale, so did Stan Lee. And this may be Stan's greatest talent. He was able to bring out so much amazing work from his collaborators. And the work they did with him was truly remarkable. And they did so much of it. That Bill Maher's collaborations pale so much in comparison is hardly a surprise. Because, let's face it, Billy Martin and Scott Carter are a far cry from Steve Ditko and Jack Kirby. If you like this, but let's face it, be sure to check out our other ones on our YouTube page, and you can find them all on our Facebook. Thank you for listening.